We apologise, especially for the removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, their communities and their country, for the pain, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants and for their families left behind, we say sorry.
On the 11th of December 1946, the General Assembly of the United Nations passed a resolution against the act of genocide. This resolution recognised that throughout history, genocide had inflicted great losses on humanity, and, whether at war or at peace, the act, attempt or incitement of others towards genocide is a crime under international law. Whilst the word genocide typically conveys images of the Holocaust or Rwanda and other mass killings of an ethnic group, the UN's definition also includes forcibly transferring children from one group to another, as in the case of the Australian government's official policy from 1909 to 1969. Around 100,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were taken from their families and raised by whites in accordance with a policy designed to assimilate and breed out Indigenous peoples from Australia. In 1967, the Holt government put forth a referendum to amend the Constitution, thus recognising Aboriginal rights and taking a step in stopping the removal of Indigenous children from their homes. However, even after the policy of forcibly abducting children ended, the Australian government refused to acknowledge the injustice of what had been done to Indigenous people. Before Kevin Rudd's election in 2007, the Howard government continually refused to apologise. A royal commission into the case found that the policies were not for the purpose of exterminating a people, but for their preservation. Also, a High Court ruling in 1997 determined that the past child removal practices did not fall into the definition of genocide. John Howard gave 3 reasons for his refusal to make a formal apology.
The first is I do not believe as an issue of principle that one generation can assume responsibility for the acts and deeds of an earlier generation. In some cases, the children were wrongly removed. In other cases, they were removed for good reason. It seems to me there's a real danger that when you do something like that, there's a psychological reaction, well, the Indigenous box has been ticked and we've solved the problem.
Finally, on the 13th of February 2008, the new Prime Minister Kevin Rudd issued an official apology to the stolen generation on behalf of the Australian government. Victims of the stolen generation were present in the gallery and the majority of Australians supported the apology. However, even today, some sections of the media and the community oppose the apology, arguing as John Howard did. And even now that it is widely viewed as a stain on Australia's history, neither Kevin Rudd's speech nor the government's official policy acknowledges the stolen generation as an act of genocide. One problem with the issue of the stolen generation is in its definition. All of the 100,000 children who were taken from their families are now known as being part of the stolen generation. The stolen generation has become a maxim that has encompassed all the children who were taken from their homes. However, most sources agree that in some cases, children were removed on the grounds of child welfare. So how do we distinguish between those who suffered and those who were saved? One historian, Keith Windschuttle, claimed that Aboriginal children were never removed from their families in order to put an end to Aboriginality, or indeed to serve any improper government policy or program, and that almost all removals were based on traditional grounds of child welfare. He also determined that racial discrimination was not the driving factor in the removal of Indigenous children. Whilst I agree that then and today there are many Indigenous children in abusive and disadvantaged homes, Windschuttle overlooks the abuse and suffering felt by the victims who were taken from their homes. He also puts forth a weak argument by using a partial definition of genocide from Article 2. The intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, or racial or religious group, and he claims that most of the children who were taken were half-castes and did not constitute any such group. Aside from ignoring the whole definition of genocide, he is claiming that being half-caste, the government has the right to place them in white homes, despite the pain and suffering that they would feel from being removed from the only family they know. Ronald Wilson, who conducted the Bringing Them Home report, which included over 500 Indigenous individual or group submissions as well as various government and church submissions, found that Indigenous families and communities had endured gross violations of their human rights. These violations continue to affect Indigenous people's daily lives. They were an act of genocide, aimed at wiping out Indigenous families, communities and cultures vital to the precious and inalienable heritage of Australia. One of the key points made in this report was that the act was intentional. A lot of the debate over whether or not the stolen generation is to be considered genocide rests on the question of intention, and according to Wilson, the intent was there. In its conclusion, the report asks for funding for the victims in order to record their history, reparations for people forcibly removed from their families, and an official apology and acknowledgement of responsibility. Even though there are those who benefited from being removed from abusive homes, this does not change the fact that there are many who suffered. As a nation, we can't shy away from the mistakes of the past, nor the responsibility that we have for the future. Kevin Rudd's speech was a landmark step in reconciliation and moving forward. However, even it pulled punches on whether or not the stolen generation constitutes genocide. The conclusion given by Wilson of the intent of the genocide is still subject to debate, and whilst there has been a formal apology and funding given to allow the victims' voices to be heard, there is yet to be any reparations paid for those who suffered, nor the acknowledgement that the stolen generation was an act of genocide.